So there's this guy, 1932. He's got a college degree, speaks like 9 languages, could have done anything with his life. And he looks at the Great Depression, looks at all these men losing everything they worked for and goes, you know what? I'm out. I'm done with all of it. Takes 1 axe, a few traps, and $1 into the deepest canyon in North America. 48 years later, he's still there. He made his own guns, bored the rifle barrels by hand, sewed every piece of clothing from deer he killed. And when the government showed up to kick him out, he built a stone fortress with gun slits and told them they'd have to kill him first. Quick thing. If you're here a lot, subscribe. Drop where you're listening from in the comments. Always wild seeing the different time zones. Alright, tonight we're heading back to 1966 Idaho. But before we go anywhere, get cozy. Like, actually cozy. Fix your pillows, grab that blanket. Where we're going, you're going to want to be settled. Picture yourself on a jet boat. The engine's roaring. Water's spraying up around you. You're deep in the gut of something called Hell's Canyon. And honestly, the name fits. This canyon plunges nearly 8,000 feet from mountaintop to river. That's deeper than the Grand Canyon. Way deeper. The walls rise up around you like prison bars made of stone, and the river beneath you, the salmon, is churning white and violent. Early explorers, including Lewis and Clark, took one look at this water and said, nope, not happening. They called it the River of No Return, and they meant it. You're a writer. Sports Illustrated sent you out here chasing a story about some hermit, some mountain man living alone in the wilderness. The locals call him Buckskin Bill. They say he's been out here for 34 years. They say he makes his own guns. They say he's half wild. You're expecting to find some grizzled, half-starved recluse, some broken man who fled civilization because it chewed him up and spit him out, some guy living in a lean-to, eating squirrels, probably crazy. The jet boat rounds a bend in the river, a place called 5 Mile Bar, and a figure emerges from the trees. He's dressed head to toe in buckskin. That's deer leather, hand-sewn by the look of it. But here's the thing, it's not ragged. It's not falling apart. It's immaculate. Like something out of a museum exhibit, but somehow better. More real. On his head sits what can only be described as a helmet. Hand-stitched leather. Styled like something the Swiss Guard would wear. It's bizarre. It's beautiful. It's completely insane. And he's smiling. This supposedly wild hermit. He's smiling at you like you're an old friend coming home for dinner. He's not shuffling, not mumbling. He walks up to your boat and introduces himself with a kind of articulate confidence you'd expect from a university professor, which, as it turns out, is closer to the truth than you'd ever have guessed. His name is Sylvan Hart, and he welcomes you not as an intruder on his solitude, but as an honoured guest in his kingdom. You think you have your story, quirky recluse, eccentric character piece, maybe 2,000 words for the Sunday magazine, human interest stuff. Then Sylvan Hart gives you the tour, your comfortable bed right now, with its clean sheets and soft pillow and temperature-controlled room. Hold on to that feeling, because what you're about to see makes your modern bedroom look like a pile of sticks. He doesn't show you a crude shelter. He shows you a 2-story lodge built from stone and timber, and not just built, engineered. The thing is designed specifically for the canyon's insane temperature swings, where summer hits 120 degrees and winter drops to -40. The first floor is built into the hillside, insulated by the earth itself for winter. The second story catches the canyon breezes for summer. It's perfect. It's genius. And he built it alone, stone by stone, log by log, over 2 years. But wait, there's more. Always more with this guy. He takes you to his blacksmith shop. There's a forge he constructed from river rock and fire clay. There's a bellows he made from deer hide and wood. There's an anvil he somehow hauled into this roadless wilderness. And hanging on the walls, covering every surface, filling every corner, are tools. Hammers, chisels, saws, knives with handles carved from deer antlers. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Every single one he made himself. Your jaw is dropping. You can feel it happening. You're a writer. You're supposed to stay objective, but come on. This is something else. And then he shows you the guns. Now here's where you need to understand something. Making a gun isn't like making a knife. It's not just shaping metal. A rifle barrel needs to be bored out perfectly straight from a solid bar of steel. We're talking tolerances of a few thousandths of an inch over several feet. This is precision work that modern factories do with specialized machinery that cost millions of dollars. It's a master-level skill that takes years of training in sophisticated workshops. Sylvan Hart taught himself to do it by hand, in a dirt floor shop. 100 miles from the nearest town, he shows you the rifle. The barrel is made from fine Swedish steel, bored and rifled by hand. The mechanism has a double cock and double set trigger that he forged himself. The stock is carved from mountain mahogany, blackened with sulfuric acid, rubbed to a deep brown shine with just the palm of his hand. There are carvings on it depicting mountain sheep. A collector once offered him a blank check for that rifle. Just write in whatever number you want. Hart said no. He explains his boring process. He starts with a solid bar of steel, uses a hand-cranked drill of his own design, spends hundreds of hours slowly, painstakingly boring out the barrel, one microscopic shaving at a time. The drill bit is hardened steel sharpened to a razor edge. He turns the crank, advances the bit a fraction of an inch, withdraws it, cleans it, repeats, for weeks, for months. The barrel has to be perfectly straight, or the gun is useless. He checks it constantly, sighting down the bore, measuring with calipers he also made himself. Then comes the rifling, cutting the spiral grooves that give a bullet its spin. Even more delicate work. He made a rifling guide, a long rod with cutting teeth arranged in a spiral. Passes it through the barrel again and again, cutting a little deeper each time. Too shallow and the bullet won't spin. Too deep and the barrel weakens. He got it right. Every time. He even makes his own bullets. Melts down lead. Casts them in moulds he carved. You're standing there with this Sports Illustrated notepad in your hand, and you realize you don't have enough pages. Not even close. This man hasn't just survived in the wilderness for 34 years. He hasn't just scratched out some miserable existence eating roots and hiding from the weather. He has recreated industrial civilization by himself, from scratch, using only what he could make with his own hands. The samovar seals it. You walk into his kitchen and there's this massive thing. A Russian-style tea urn nearly 3 feet tall, made from copper and brass with elaborate decorative elements hammered into the metal. It has a central chimney for burning charcoal, which heats the water in the surrounding chamber. It has a spigot at the bottom for drawing off hot water. A small teapot sits on top, kept warm by the rising heat. It's beautiful. Museum quality. It looks like it belongs in a Russian palace. He made it. Of course he made it. From scrap copper and brass he found in abandoned mining camps scattered through the canyon, relics of the gold rush days. And here's the thing that really gets you. He'd never seen a real samovar. He'd only read about them in books. He recreated it entirely from memory and imagination. You ask him about this, about how, about why. And he just shrugs. My idea of art, he tells you, is to make sure you have good utensils, things you use every day, before you go fooling with pictures. The Scandinavian idea, he calls it. You're writing furiously now, trying to capture everything. The stone walls, the handmade furniture, tables and chairs and shelves all fitted together with mortise and tenon joints. No nails, no screws, just wood precisely shaped and fitted. The candles made from deer tallow. The oil lamps fueled by fish oil from salmon he catches in traps he wove from willow branches. Every single object in this home was made by his hands, and he's not done showing you around. Outside the lodge, he's got a garden. A serious garden. Something like 10,000 square feet of vegetables and herbs, growing in terraces he built into the rocky volcanic soil. The canyon ground is naturally poor, rocky, acidic. He amended it with compost he makes from fish guts and plant waste. He dug a ditch from a spring higher up the canyon and built an irrigation system using wooden troughs and stone channels. Potatoes, carrots, beans, squash. He saves seeds from year to year, selecting the plants that do best in the canyon's harsh conditions. Over the decades, he's developed his own strains, perfectly adapted to this specific place. In a good year, he harvests over 2,000 pounds of potatoes alone. He stores them in a root cellar he dug into the hillside where the temperature stays a constant 45 degrees year-round. He dries beans and corn, makes sauerkraut from cabbage, fermenting it in wooden barrels, preserves fruit in jars sealed with wax. By October, his pantry is full. By April, it's nearly empty. Then he starts again. And that's just the vegetables. There's also the fishing. The salmon river is full of steelhead trout, chinook salmon and sturgeon. Hart built fish traps from woven willow branches, ingenious funnel-shaped devices that let fish swim in but not out. He places them in the eddies and backwaters where fish congregate. During the spring and fall salmon runs, he can catch enough fish in a single day to feed himself for a month. He smokes the fish over alderwood, hangs them in a smokehouse he built from river rock and timber, makes fish oil by rendering the fat, stores it in clay pots, uses it for cooking, for waterproofing his boots, for fuel in his lamps. Nothing is wasted. Everything connects. Everything serves multiple purposes. You're beginning to understand that you're not looking at a hermit. You're not looking at someone who fled civilization. You're looking at someone who built a new one. The sun is setting now. The canyon walls are turning gold, then orange, then purple. The salmon river is black and silver in the fading light. And Sylvan Hart, Buckskin Bill, is serving you tea from his handmade samovar in a cup he forged himself, while sitting in a chair he carved from canyon wood, wearing clothes he sewed from deer he hunted with a gun he made from scratch. You ask him the obvious question, the question everyone asks, why? And his answer changes everything you thought you knew about modern life, about independence, about what one person can actually accomplish when they stop depending on everyone else for everything. But that's not where this story starts. To understand this moment, to understand this man and this place and this impossible achievement, you need to go back. Back to 1932. Back to a time when America was falling apart. Back to a young man standing in the Texas oil fields, covered in grease, watching the world burn, making a decision that would define the next half-century of his life. The Great Depression had its teeth in America's throat. The stock market had crashed 3 years earlier. Unemployment hit 23%. Factories went silent. Farms turned to dust. The American dream felt like a cruel joke told at a funeral. And in the middle of all that chaos, a 26-year-old roughneck named Sylvan Hart looked at the men around him. Men with families, men broken by debt, men with that look in their eyes, that quiet desperation, that total dependence on a system that had failed them completely, a system of money and bosses and banks, a system where your life was never really your own. And he made a choice. He was done. Not just with this job, not just with this oil field. He was done with the entire 20th century. He had a different idea of wealth, not money in a bank that could disappear overnight, but skill in his hands that could never be taken away, not a house in a suburb that a bank could foreclose on, but a fortress in the wilderness that was truly his. He wanted to build a life that no stock market crash, no depression, no boss, no bank, no government could ever take from him. So he packed what little he had, headed north, looking for a place so remote, so inaccessible, that the modern world would forget he even existed. He found Hell's Canyon, and for $1, he bought 50 acres of freedom. What happens next is one of the most remarkable survival stories ever lived. Not because he almost died, though he did, several times. Not because the conditions were brutal, though they were, almost unbearably so. But because this educated man with his degree in English and his knowledge of Latin and Greek and half a dozen other languages, this polymath who could discuss Kant and nuclear physics and the fall of Rome, chose to apply every ounce of his intellect to the oldest human challenge there is. Survival, on his own terms, by his own hands, forever. Your pillow is soft right now. Your room is the right temperature. You didn't have to make anything you're touching, wearing, or using. You didn't have to hunt for your dinner or dig your water from a spring or spend months boring a rifle barrel by hand. That's not a criticism. That's just reality. The reality of modern life. The reality that Sylvan Hart walked away from on the day in 1932 when he crossed into Hell's Canyon and started building something extraordinary. The question isn't whether you could do what he did. Almost nobody could. The question is what it means that he did it at all. What it proves about human capability. What it says about the trade-offs we make every day without even thinking about them. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, you need to understand what that first winter was like, what it really cost him, what almost broke him, and how the worst 47 days of his life forged the man who would become a legend. The winter of 1932 to 33 was one of the coldest on record in Idaho, and Sylvan Hart arrived at 5 Mile Bar with an axe, a few traps, a head full of books, and absolutely no idea what he was getting into. 1932. Texas. Oil country. The whole state smells like. Crude and sweat and desperation. The Depression's been grinding America down for 3 years now, and everybody's feeling it. Banks closing, farms foreclosing, 1 in 4 men can't find work. The ones who can are holding on with both hands, terrified of what happens if they let go. Sylvan Hart's working the oil fields, roughneck work, brutal stuff. You're out there in the sun, covered in grease, muscles screaming, and for what? Pennies. Just enough to keep going another day. But here's the thing about Sylvan. He's not like the other guys on the rig. Most roughnecks back then, they're uneducated. Farm boys, drifters, men who ended up in the oil fields because there was nowhere else to go. And that's fine. Nothing wrong with that. Hard work is hard work. Sylvan Hart has a degree in English from McPherson College in Kansas. He studied petroleum engineering at the University of Oklahoma. Didn't finish the graduate program, but still. The guy's educated, and not just educated. He taught himself languages. We're talking Latin, Greek, German, Russian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Norwegian, Swahili, out there in the Texas oil fields. A guy who can read ancient Greek and speak Swahili, hauling pipe under the summer sun because the economy collapsed and there's nothing else. Think about that for a second. You're lying in your comfortable bed right now, probably within reach of a phone that has access to every book ever written. Sylvan Hart memorized entire languages for fun, learned them from books he borrowed or bought with whatever money he could scrape together. And now he's working alongside men who can barely sign their own names, doing the same back-breaking labour, earning the same nothing wages. He watches the other workers, really watches them. Men with wives, kids, mortgages, men who did everything right, worked hard, saved money, played by the rules, and now they've got nothing. The bank took the house, the factory closed, the farm dried up and blew away. These men built their whole lives on a system, and the system failed. Just stopped working one day. And there wasn't a damn thing any of them could do about it. Sylvan sees this. He sees the desperation in their eyes, the way they flinch when they hear about another bank closing, the way they talk about their families with this edge of panic they can't quite hide. And something clicks. These men are dependent, completely dependent, on bosses who can fire them, on banks that can fail, on stores that can run out of food, on a whole web of systems and institutions that can collapse at any moment for reasons nobody understands. They don't know how to feed themselves without a grocery store, can't clothe themselves without a factory, can't shelter themselves without a construction company, can't defend themselves without a police force. We've traded something important, Sylvan thinks, something essential, given it up for convenience and comfort. He can't do anything for himself. Modern man, he realizes, is like a baby, helpless without his systems, his supply chains, his civilization. And when that civilization breaks down, when the gears stop turning, he's got nothing. Sylvan Hart decides, right there in the Texas heat, surrounded by the smell of oil and the sound of desperate men, that he's not going to be one of them. He's not going to spend his life depending on systems that can fail, on money that can become worthless, on jobs that can disappear. He's going to learn how to do everything himself, build everything himself, become completely, totally, utterly independent, not as a hobby, not as a side project, as his entire life. He needs land, somewhere remote, somewhere the modern world can't reach him, somewhere he can disappear and build something real. He heads north. Idaho's got wilderness, real wilderness, not parks with ranger stations and gift shops. We're talking millions of acres where no roads go, where no people live, where you can walk for weeks without seeing another human being. He finds it on the banks of the Salmon River, a place called 5 Mile Bar, 50 acres of rocky ground at the bottom of Hell's Canyon. The canyon's a monster, 8,000 feet from mountaintop to river in some places, the deepest river gorge in North America. The walls are ancient granite, folded and twisted by forces that were old when dinosaurs were young. The river itself is a churning nightmare of white water and rapids. Lewis and Clark took one look and turned around, called it the River of No Return. The nearest town is 40 miles away, and there's no road. You walk, or you don't go. Sylvan buys the whole 50 acres for $1. $1. That's what freedom costs in 1932, if you're willing to work for it. He arrives in late fall. Bad timing. The worst possible timing, actually. He's got an axe, a few traps, some basic supplies, books, because of course he brought books, and absolutely no idea what he's really gotten himself into. He builds a shelter, not a cabin, not yet, just a dugout, half buried in the earth, with some logs and branches for a roof. It's crude. It's barely adequate for a summer camping trip. Winter comes early that year. Hell's Canyon has this weird thing going on with temperature. In summer, it's an oven. 120 degrees sometimes, the heat radiating off the rock walls until you can't breathe. But winter in the canyon is something else entirely. The canyon creates what's called a temperature inversion. Cold air is heavy, right? Sinks down. And in a canyon this deep, that cold air pools at the bottom like water in a bathtub. Settles on the river, just sits there, getting colder and colder, with nowhere to go. That first winter, temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. -40. That's cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Cold enough to turn the river, the mighty salmon, into ice in places. Cold enough to kill a man who isn't ready for it. Sylvan Hart wasn't ready. He burned through his firewood supply by mid-January. Started burning sagebrush instead. Sagebrush burns hot but fast. You've got to feed it constantly. He was getting up every 2 hours, all night long, to keep the fire going. Sleep 2 hours, wake up, feed the fire, sleep 2 hours, wake up, feed the fire. His hands developed frostbite. His lips cracked and bled. He lost 23 pounds, and he wasn't carrying much extra weight to begin with. The temperature stayed below zero for 47 consecutive days, December 15th to January 31st. 47 days of cold so intense that his breath froze the moment it left his mouth. 47 days of fighting to stay alive in a dugout that couldn't really keep him warm no matter how much sagebrush he burned. He thought about leaving. Of course he did. Anybody would. Hiking out, finding civilization, admitting defeat. But here's the thing about Sylvan Hart. The guy was stubborn. Not regular stubborn. Not even mule stubborn. We're talking a level of stubbornness that borders on mental illness. Once he decided something, that was it. Done. No going back. He decided to live out here, to build a life with his own hands, and some cold weather wasn't going to change that. So he survived. Barely. Lost some feeling in his fingers that never fully came back. Came out of that winter gaunt and weak and haunted looking, but alive, and more importantly, educated. See, that winter taught him something. All those books he'd read about pioneers and frontiersmen and mountain men, those stories made it sound romantic, tough but doable. A man against nature winning through grit and determination. The reality was different. Those old-timers weren't just tough. They had skills, hundreds of skills, thousands of skills. Things they learned from their parents, who learned from their parents, who learned from their parents. A whole inheritance of knowledge about how to survive without modern conveniences. Sylvan had read about these skills, but reading about something and doing it are two very different things. He didn't know how to build a proper shelter for this climate, didn't know how to preserve food for an 8-month winter, didn't know how to make warm clothes from animal hides, didn't know how to forge tools or bore rifle barrels or build furniture without nails. He was an educated man. A genius, probably, if IQ tests mean anything. But education isn't the same as knowledge, and knowledge isn't the same as skill. That winter stripped away everything he thought he knew, every assumption he'd made about how this was going to work, every romantic notion about living off the land. What was left? A man, alone, in the deepest canyon in North America, with one question burning in his mind: how do I make sure this never happens again? Spring came eventually. It always does. The ice broke up on the river. The cold air drained out of the canyon. The sun started warming the rocks again. Sylvan Hart emerged from his dugout like a ghost, thin, battered, changed, but not broken. He looked at his pathetic shelter, at the scorch marks where he'd burned sagebrush all night, at the frozen remains of the food he'd run through too fast, and he made a plan. Not a plan to leave, a plan to stay, a plan to build something so good, so complete, so perfectly adapted to this specific place that no winter would ever threaten him again. He was going to build a house, a real house, stone and timber, designed specifically for the canyon's insane temperature swings. He was going to build a blacksmith shop, learn to forge his own tools from scrap metal. He was going to plant a garden, figure out how to grow food in this rocky, acidic soil. He was going to hunt, fish, trap, learn every edible plant in the canyon, learn how to preserve meat and vegetables for the long winter. He was going to make his own clothes, tan his own leather, sew his own buckskin, and eventually he was going to make his own guns, from scratch. Because a man without a good rifle in this country is a man waiting to die. All of it. Every skill he'd read about, every technique the old mountain men knew. He was going to learn it, master it, improve it, starting now. The construction took 2 years. Just the house. 2 years of quarrying stone from the canyon walls, felling timber with his axe, hauling everything to the building site on his back because there were no roads, no pack animals, just one man and his determination. He mixed mortar from river sand and lime he burned from limestone deposits he found upstream, notched each log by hand, chinked the gaps with moss and clay. The design was clever. First floor built into the hillside, insulated by the earth itself. That would be his winter quarters. The dirt walls stayed a constant temperature, cool in summer, relatively warm in winter. Less firewood needed, less chance of freezing to death. Second floor open to the air, with big windows to catch the canyon breezes. Summer quarters. When it hit 120 degrees down here, you needed every breath of wind you could get. 2 stories, stone foundation, timber frame, all of it done by one man with hand tools over 2 years. And that was just the beginning. The blacksmith shop came next. This was the key to everything. With a forge, he could make tools. With tools, he could build anything. He found an anvil. Don't ask me how. Probably some abandoned mining equipment from the gold rush days. The canyon was full of that stuff. Rusty picks and broken saws and chains that nobody wanted anymore. In Sylvan's hands, that junk became treasure. He built the forge from river rock and fire clay. Constructed a bellows from deer hide stretched over a wooden frame. When he pumped it, air rushed into the forge, and the temperature climbed high enough to work steel. His first hammer was crude, but he used it to make a better hammer, and used that to make a better one still. Each tool allowed him to make the next tool. Each skill opened the door to the next skill. Hammers, chisels, saws, knives with handles carved from deer antlers, files, punches, dies and taps in sizes you wouldn't believe. He scavenged metal from everywhere. Old mining equipment, abandoned moonshine stills, anything made of iron or steel or copper or brass. He'd haul it back to his shop, heat it in the forge, and transform it into something useful. The sound of his hammer rang through the canyon, day after day, year after year. a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. Each swing was a declaration. Each finished tool was a vote for independence, a vote for self-reliance, a vote against the system that had failed all those desperate men back in the Texas oil fields. The canyon walls echoed with it. The river carried the sound downstream, and Sylvan Hart, the college boy with his languages and his books, was becoming something else entirely. He was becoming Buckskin Bill. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because before he could become a legend, before visitors would motor up the river to marvel at his handmade world, before Sports Illustrated would send writers to document his life, Sylvan Hart had to figure out something much more basic. How to not starve. The garden was a problem. This canyon soil wasn't meant for growing vegetables. Rocky, acidic, full of volcanic debris that had been settling here for millions of years. You couldn't just plant seeds and expect them to grow. He started hauling dirt from the riverbank. Rich stuff, full of nutrients from all the dead salmon that rotted there every year after spawning. Mixed it with fish guts and plant waste. Made his own compost. Then he built terraces. Stone walls stacked up the hillside, creating flat growing spaces where water wouldn't wash away the soil. Back-breaking work, moving rocks by hand, piling them up, filling in behind them with his amended dirt. Dug a ditch from a spring higher up the canyon, built wooden troughs to carry the water down to his garden plots, stone channels to distribute it evenly, trial and error. So much trial and error. Plants that died, crops that failed, seeds that never sprouted. But slowly, over years, he figured it out. Which vegetables could handle the short growing season? Which ones needed shade from the brutal summer sun? Which ones could take the cold nights? Potatoes did well. Carrots, beans, squash, cabbage for making sauerkraut. He saved seeds from the best plants, the ones that grew strongest in this specific place, planted those seeds the next year, saved the best again. Over time, he developed his own strains. Vegetables evolved specifically for Hell's Canyon. Darwin would have been proud. The hunting and fishing came easier. The canyon was full of game. Deer everywhere. Elk moving through in the fall. Bighorn sheep on the rocky slopes, and the river, thus. Salmon was absolutely stuffed with fish. He built traps, wove them from willow branches, funnel-shaped things that let fish swim in but confused them so they couldn't find their way out. Placed them in the slow water where fish like to rest. During the salmon runs, spring and fall, he could catch more fish than he knew what to do with. Built a smokehouse from river rock, hung the fish over alderwood fires. The smoke preserved the meat and gave it this rich, savoury flavour that made his mouth water just thinking about it. He rendered fish oil from the fatty salmon, stored it in clay pots, used it for cooking, for waterproofing his boots, for fuel in the lamps he made from clay, and twisted plant fibre wicks. The deer he hunted with his rifle. Later, with rifles he made himself. But that's another story. What mattered was that he was learning. Every season taught him something new. Every failure pointed toward a better way. And every success was proof. Proof that he could do this. Proof that a man with enough determination could provide for himself, completely, without depending on anyone or anything. The roughnecks back in Texas, the men with the desperate eyes and the mortgages they couldn't pay, they were still out there probably, still grinding away at jobs that might disappear tomorrow, still dependent on systems they couldn't control. Sylvan Hart was free. Not comfortable, not yet, but free. And freedom, he was learning, was something you built. One stone at a time, one tool at a time, one skill at a time. Your pillow's probably pretty soft right now. Your room's probably the right temperature. You've got food in the kitchen and clean water from the tap and clothes you bought at a store. None of that's wrong. That's just modern life. But think about Sylvan for a second. Think about what it took to get to the point where he could feed himself, clothe himself, shelter himself, completely on his own. Years. It took years. And he was just getting started. Because tools and gardens and smokehouses were one thing. What he really wanted to make, what would truly prove he'd mastered this life, was something far more complicated. He wanted to make guns, real guns, working guns, guns he could hunt with and defend himself with and be proud of, and not just assemble them from parts. Anybody could do that. He wanted to make them from scratch. Every piece, including the barrels. If you know anything about gunsmithing, you know that's insane. The barrel is the hardest part. It has to be bored perfectly straight through solid steel, with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Modern factories use million-dollar machines for this. Sylvan Hart was going to do it by hand, in a dirt floor shop, with tools he made himself. Because why not? That's how his mind worked. If it could be done, he could learn to do it. If humans had ever figured out how to make something, he could figure it out too. It would just take time and patience and a level of stubbornness that most people can't even imagine. The sound of his hammer echoed off the canyon walls, day after day, year after year. And somewhere in that rhythm, somewhere in that endless repetition of heating and shaping and cooling and starting again, Sylvan Hart disappeared, and Buckskin Bill was born. Making a knife is one thing. Heat some steel, pound it flat, grind an edge. Anybody with patience and a forge can figure that out eventually. Making a gun is something else entirely. A gun has dozens of moving parts that have to work together perfectly. The trigger mechanism alone has springs and levers and catches that need to move exactly right, or the whole thing's useless or dangerous. A gun that fires when you don't want it to is worse than no gun at all. But the hardest part, the barrel. A rifle barrel starts as a solid bar of steel. You have to bore a hole through the entire length of that bar, perfectly straight, perfectly centered, perfectly smooth. We're talking tolerances of a few thousandths of an inch, over 2-3 feet of steel. If the hole wanders even slightly, the barrel's ruined. If the walls end up uneven, the barrel's weak. Might explode in your face when you fire it. Modern gun factories use computerized machines that cost more than most houses. Precision equipment designed specifically for this one job. Teams of engineers spent years developing these systems. Sylvan Hart looked at all that and said, "Nah, I'll do it by hand, in a dirt floor shop, with tools he made himself, 100 miles from the nearest town." Here's how crazy this is. He starts with a solid bar of Swedish steel. Good stuff. The kind that holds up under the pressure of firing. He's got this bar clamped in a jig he built, held perfectly still. Then he brings out this drill he made, hand cranked. Nothing fancy looking. Just a long steel rod with a cutting bit on the end that he sharpened himself from hardened steel. He positions the bit against the end of the steel bar, takes a breath, and starts cranking. The bit bites into the steel. Tiny shavings curl away. He cranks. More shavings. He withdraws the bit, cleans it, clears out the shavings, goes back in, cranks some more, a fraction of an inch at a time. That's it. That's the process. Hours and hours and hours of turning a crank, withdrawing the bit, cleaning it, going back in, day after day, week after week. A single rifle barrel took him months of sitting in his shop, cranking that drill, checking the hole with gauges he made, measuring everything with calipers he forged from scrap metal. The slightest wobble, the tiniest drift off centre, and all that work was wasted. He didn't have a single barrel fail. Not one. Think about that. A self-taught gunsmith working alone with primitive tools achieved precision that modern factories need $1 million machines to match. How? Patience. That's part of it. The guy had more patience than a spider building a web in a windstorm. But also something else, something harder to explain. He understood the steel, understood it in a way that you can only understand something you've worked with for years. He could feel when the bit was cutting clean and when it was starting to bind. Could tell by the sound, by the resistance, by something in his hands that told him when to push and when to back off. That kind of knowledge doesn't come from books. It comes from doing, from thousands of hours of practice, from failures that teach you what success feels like. After the boring came the rifling, and this was even trickier. A smooth barrel fires a bullet, sure, but the bullet tumbles through the air. It's inaccurate. Maybe fine for close range, but useless for hitting anything beyond 100 yards or so. Rifling changes that. You cut spiral grooves down the inside of the barrel. When the bullet fires, it catches those grooves and spins. A spinning bullet flies straight, stable, accurate. The grooves have to be cut at exactly the right angle. Too steep and the bullet spins too fast, loses energy. Too shallow and it doesn't spin enough to stabilize. And all the grooves have to be identical. Same depth, same width, same spiral. Sylvan made a rifling guide. A long steel rod with cutting teeth arranged in a spiral pattern. He'd insert it into the barrel, push it through, and the teeth would cut a little bit of the grooves. Then he'd pull it out, add a tiny shim between the teeth and the guide to make the next cut deeper, and run it through again. Over and over, each pass cutting a fraction deeper. Too shallow, and the bullet wouldn't spin right. Too deep, and the barrel walls got too thin. Dangerous. He got it right. Every time. The rifles he made weren't crude, weren't wall hangers you'd show to your friends and laugh about. They were beautiful, functional, deadly accurate. One had a stock carved from mountain mahogany, blackened with sulfuric acid and rubbed to a deep shine with just the palm of his hand. Carvings of mountain sheep decorated the wood. The barrel was .45 caliber, bored from Swedish steel, double cock, double set trigger mechanism, all of it forged and fitted by hand. A collector once offered him a blank check for that rifle. Write in any number you want. Hart said no. Some things aren't for sale. He made pistols too. Handguns with the same precision, the same attention to detail. Made his own bullets by melting lead and casting them in moulds he carved. Every gun he built he tested obsessively. Fired hundreds of rounds through each one. Adjusted the sights. Refined the trigger pull. Made sure everything worked exactly the way it should. And then he'd start on the next one. He never took less than a year on a single firearm. Usually longer, no rushing, no shortcuts. Just steady, patient work until the thing was perfect. The rangers who patrolled the area gave him a nickname. Started calling him Buckskin, Bill, because of the clothes. See, Hart didn't just make his tools and weapons, he made everything he wore. Deer were everywhere in the canyon. He'd shoot one, butcher it, eat the meat. But the hide, that was valuable. Too valuable to waste. Most people, if they tan a deerskin at all, they do it with the smooth side out. The grain side. Makes a leather that's water resistant, looks nice. Hart wore his buckskin with the hair side against his skin. Weird choice, right? But like everything he did, there was a reason. Deer hair is hollow. Each strand is basically a tiny tube, and hollow tubes trap air. Air is an insulator. So wearing the deer hair against his skin created this layer of trapped air between him and the leather. Kept him warm in winter. And here's the strange part. It also kept him cooler in summer. The same principle works both ways. The tanning process was brutal. Labour-intensive doesn't begin to describe it. First, he'd skin the deer. Carefully. You want the hide in one piece, no holes, no cuts. Then he'd scrape it. Both sides. The outer side has fat and tissue clinging to it. Has to come off. The inner side has a membrane. Also has to come off. He made scrapers from deer leg bones sharpened to a curved edge. Hours of scraping. Arms aching, hands cramping. After that came the braining. Yeah, braining. The deer's brain. Every animal has enough brain matter to tan its own hide. That's not a coincidence. The brain contains natural oils and enzymes that break down the proteins in the skin, makes the leather soft and pliable instead of stiff like rawhide. Hart would crack open the deer's skull, scoop out the brain, mash it up in warm water. Then he'd soak the hide in that slurry, work it in with his hands, squeeze it through the fibres, let it sit, then wring it out, soak it again, wring it out, over and over. After the braining came the stretching. This was the hard part. While the hide was still damp, he had to stretch it constantly, pull it, knead it, work it with his hands. If he let it dry without stretching, it would harden back into stiff, useless rawhide. So he'd stretch for hours, working every inch of the hide until his arms burned and his fingers went numb. Then smoking. He'd hang the stretched hide over a fire of green wood. The smoke penetrated the fibres, gave the leather its tan colour, made it water-resistant. Without the smoking, the first time the buckskin got wet, all that braining and stretching would be undone. The whole process, from fresh hide to finished buckskin, took about a week of constant work, and that was just the leather. Then he had to cut it, sew it. He used sinew for thread, tendons from the deer, dried and split into fine strands, stronger than any commercial thread, and when sinew gets wet, it swells. Then as it dries, it shrinks, pulling the seams tighter, creates a waterproof seal. He hand-stitched everything, shirts, pants, moccasins, gloves, even that crazy Swiss Guard helmet. That became his trademark. Each piece of clothing was a work of art. The jacket had fringe along the arms and back, not for decoration. The fringe channeled rainwater away from his body, kept him drier. The moccasins had double-thick soles made from the toughest part of the hide, the section from the deer's back where the skin is thickest. He replaced them once a year when the canyon rocks finally wore through the leather. The helmet was genius, wide brim to shade his eyes from the brutal summer sun, ear flaps that tied down in winter wind, the crown stuffed with dried grass for insulation. It looked eccentric, looked like something a lunatic would wear, but it worked better than anything you could buy in a store. He wore buckskin every single day, for decades. The same jacket, the same pants, maintained and repaired and eventually replaced with new pieces he made the same way. A suit of buckskin took a couple of weeks to make, but once finished, it lasted for years. Tough enough to handle the canyon's rough country, flexible enough to work in, warm in winter, cool in summer, and completely free. Well, free if you don't count the labour, which Hart didn't. Labour was just how you spent your days. It wasn't something to avoid. It was the whole point. The routine emerged over years. Seasons shaped his life the way they shaped everything in the canyon. Spring was planting time, getting the garden going, repairing whatever winter had damaged, the river running high with snowmelt, fish starting to move. Summer was tending, weeding the garden, fishing, making repairs to his buildings, the forge going constantly, always something to make, always some tool that could be improved. Fall was the frantic season, harvesting everything from the garden, smoking fish, jerking venison, drying beans and corn, fermenting cabbage into sauerkraut, stocking the root cellar, cutting firewood. So much firewood. You could never have too much firewood. Winter was maintenance and making, tool work, leather work, reading. God, the reading. He had hundreds of books in that cabin. History, philosophy, science, literature. He'd hauled them all in, one backpack load at a time over the years, 12 to 14 hours of work a day, every day, for decades. That's over 200,000 hours. 200,000 hours of labour, all by hand, all alone. And you know what? He didn't seem tired of it. Didn't seem worn down or burned out or bitter. The man genuinely loved his life. He'd tell visitors about it sometimes, about why he did it. And his answer was always the same. Freedom. Not freedom like people use the word now. Not freedom to buy whatever you want or go wherever you want or do whatever feels good. Real freedom. Self-reliance. The ability to provide for yourself completely without depending on anyone or anything that could fail you. Modern man, he'd say, has traded his birthright for convenience. He can't feed himself, can't clothe himself, can't shelter himself, can't defend himself. He's utterly dependent on a system that can fail at any moment. I chose differently. I chose to be free. Radical stuff for the 1950s and 60s. America was falling in love with consumerism back then. Suburbs, shopping malls. The idea that technology would solve all problems. That progress meant making things easier, more convenient, more dependent on systems you didn't understand and couldn't control. Hart was a living counter-argument. Proof that another way was possible. Not better, necessarily. Not for everyone, but possible. The sound of his hammer still echoed through the canyon. The smoke from his forge still rose into the sky. And every tool, every gun, every piece of clothing was testimony. Testimony that one man with enough skill and enough stubbornness could build a complete life with nothing but his own two hands. Your bed is soft right now. Your room is comfortable. Tomorrow you'll probably eat food someone else grew, wear clothes someone else made, use tools someone else designed. That's fine. That's normal. That's the trade-off we all make. But somewhere in the back of your mind, maybe you're wondering, what would it be like? What would it feel like to make everything yourself? To need nothing and no one? Sylvan Hart knew, and for 48 years he lived it. The canyon shaped him, and he shaped the canyon right back. He knew every trail, every fishing hole, every spot where deer liked to bed down. He knew which plants were edible, which were medicinal, which would kill you. Knew the weather patterns, could read the sky and tell you what was coming 3 days out. Rattlesnakes were everywhere in summer, coiled in the rocks, waiting. He learned to watch where he put his hands, where he stepped, learned to listen for that dry buzz that meant back away slowly. Black bears roamed the canyon, mountain lions too. He respected them, gave them space. They generally left him alone, but he always carried one of his handmade pistols when he went out, just in case. The river was the real danger. The salmon was unpredictable. Flash floods could raise the water level 10 feet in a matter of hours. He'd watch the weather upstream, watch the river level, know when to move to higher ground. Spring of 52, a massive flood swept through, carried away trees, boulders, anything in its path. Hart watched from his lodge as the water rose to within 50 feet of his front door. His garden was underwater, his fish traps destroyed, but the lodge held. Built high on the hillside, built smart. When the water receded, he just started rebuilding. That's what you did out here. You didn't complain. You didn't wait for help. You rebuilt. Winter of 49 was the other bad one. A blizzard buried his cabin under 6 feet of snow, trapped inside for 3 weeks. He rationed his food, burned furniture for warmth when the firewood ran low, read the same books over and over because he couldn't get to his library. When the snow finally melted enough to dig out, he was gaunt, weak, but he survived. He always survived. And there were moments that made it worth it. Moments that no tourist would ever see. The way the light hit the river at dawn, turning the water to liquid gold. The stars on clear winter nights, so bright and so many they actually cast shadows. Herds of elk moving through in fall, silent and majestic. The cry of an eagle echoing off the canyon walls. These were his rewards, his payment for all that labour. He made music too, carved flutes from river cane, played them in the evenings, the sound drifting over the water, sang folk songs in multiple languages. Terrible singer by all accounts, voice like a rusty gate. But he sang anyway, because he could, because no one was around to complain. He was alone, but not lonely. That's something most people don't understand. There's a difference. Alone is a physical state. Lonely is an emotional one. Hart had his work, his books, his music, his thoughts. A life of the mind in the heart of the wilderness. The forge was his meditation. The rhythmic hammering cleared his head. Let him think. Let him be. And slowly, over years, word started to spread. There's a guy out there, in the deepest canyon in America, makes his own guns, lives like it's 1844. People started wondering, who is this man? How does he do it? Why? Eventually, inevitably, people started coming to find out. And that's when everything changed. Because the world Sylvan Hart had worked so hard to escape, it was coming to find him. First in the form of curious visitors, then in the form of the United States government. And Hart was going to have to decide just how far he was willing to go to keep what he'd built. Turns out, pretty damn far. The samovar is what really got people talking. Visitors would come through, river runners mostly, and Hart would show them around his place. The lodge, the forge, the guns, all impressive stuff. But it was the samovar that made their jaws drop. This thing sat in his kitchen like it belonged in a Russian palace, nearly 3 feet tall, copper and brass, hammered into shape by hand. Elaborate decorative elements worked into the metal, curves and flourishes that looked like they came from some European craftsman's workshop. It was a tea urn, traditional Russian design. You burn charcoal in a central chimney, and that heats the water in the chamber surrounding it. Spigot at the bottom to draw off hot water. Little teapot perched on top, kept warm by the rising heat. Beautiful, functional, museum quality. Hart had never seen a real samovar in his life. He'd read about them, in books, descriptions of how they worked, what they looked like, how the different parts fit together. And from those descriptions, from words on a page, he recreated the whole thing from memory and imagination. The copper and brass came from abandoned mining camps scattered, through the canyon. Old equipment, broken machinery, junk, basically. But Hart didn't see junk. He saw raw material. He'd haul the metal back to his shop, heat it in the forge, hammer it into sheets, then slowly, painstakingly, shape those sheets into the curves and chambers of the samovar. Joining the pieces, working the decorations, getting everything to fit together just right. The whole process took months, maybe longer. He never said exactly. When it was done, he had a working tea urn that would have impressed a Russian aristocrat. Made from garbage, in a dirt floor shop, by a guy in buckskin who'd never travelled east of Kansas. That's what got people. Not just that he could do it, but how he could do it. The mental leap from reading about something to building it from scratch. The ability to visualize how all the pieces fit together, to solve engineering problems without ever seeing the solution, to create something beautiful from nothing but scraps and determination. The samovar was a symbol. Hart knew that. He'd tell visitors about it. My idea of art, he'd say, is to make sure you have good utensils first, things you use every day, before you go fooling with pictures. The Scandinavian idea, he called it. And he wasn't wrong. Look around his cabin and everything was like that. Functional art, useful beauty, tables and chairs carved from canyon wood, fitted together with mortise and tenon joints. No nails, no screws, just wood precisely shaped to hold itself together. Bowls and dishes made from wood, clay, stone. Spoons and ladles he carved during long winter evenings. Baskets woven from willow branches for storing his harvest. Candles from deer tallow, poured into moulds with wicks made from twisted plant fibres. Oil lamps fueled by fish oil. Dim light, flickering, but enough to read by. And read he did, hours every night. History, philosophy, science, literature, anything he could get his hands on. The man's knowledge was ridiculous, not just broad but deep. He could discuss the fall of Rome, the philosophy of Kant, nuclear physics, and the poetry of Wordsworth all in the same conversation. Quote passages from memory, argue points, draw connections between ideas that seemed totally unrelated. He knew geology because he had to, needed to identify the right stone for building, the right ore for smelting. He knew metallurgy because he had to. Different metals behave differently under heat and stress. Get it wrong, and your tools break. Your guns explode. He knew botany, which plants were edible, which were medicinal, which would grow in his garden, which would kill you. He knew animal behaviour, had to, if he wanted to hunt successfully. He knew hydrology, designed that irrigation system from the spring to his garden, understood how water moved, where it collected, how to channel it. He knew architecture, built structures that could handle temperature swings from -40 to 120 degrees. He knew chemistry. Tanning hides requires chemistry. Preserving food requires chemistry. Making gunpowder requires chemistry. He knew ballistics, made guns that shot straight. That's physics, math, engineering all rolled together. And on top of all that practical knowledge, he had the books, the philosophy, the history, the literature. He wasn't some uneducated mountain man who got lucky. He was a genuine polymath who chose to apply his intellect to the oldest human challenge, survival, on his own terms. Visitors would sit in his cabin, drinking tea from his handmade samovar, and realize they were talking to one of the most remarkable people they'd ever meet. This guy in buckskin, with the wild beard and the strange helmet, was smarter than most college professors, more skilled than most craftsmen, more self-sufficient than anyone they'd ever imagined. And he'd chosen this life on purpose. The only time Hart left the canyon was during World War II. 1942. Pearl Harbor had happened a few months before. America was mobilizing. Every able-bodied man was either enlisting or getting drafted. Hart hiked out of his canyon and volunteered. Think about that for a second. This guy had spent a decade building a life specifically designed to be independent from civilization, had rejected the modern world completely, and when that world went to war, he walked 40 miles through wilderness to sign up. The military rejected him. Doctor found he had an enlarged heart, not fit for combat, but they didn't send him home. They sent him to a Boeing plant in Kansas, put him to work on something called the Norden bomb site. Now, if you don't know what the Norden bomb site was, here's the short version. It was basically the iPhone of World War II military technology, the most sophisticated targeting computer ever built, a mechanical brain that could calculate where bombs would land based on altitude, airspeed, wind drift, and a dozen other variables. The Allies thought it would win the war, thought it would let them bomb targets with surgical precision from high altitude. They guarded the plans like they guarded nuclear secrets. Bombardiers took oaths to protect it with their lives. If a plane went down in enemy territory, crews were supposed to destroy the bomb site before anything else. And Sylvan Hart, the mountain man from Hell's Canyon, spent 3 years working on it. The guy who bored rifle barrels by hand in a dirt floor shop was suddenly helping build the most complex mechanical device of the war. His metalworking skills, his precision, his ability to understand how parts fit together. All of it was useful. He never talked much about those years, just said the work was interesting, the people were decent. But the whole experience reminded him why he'd left in the first place. Because here's the thing about war. It's the ultimate expression of everything Hart hated about modern civilization. Massive systems, huge bureaucracies, individual people reduced to cogs in machines they don't understand, your life controlled by forces beyond your comprehension. The bomb site was brilliant technology. Hart appreciated that. But what was it for? Dropping bombs on cities, killing people who'd never done anything to him personally. All in service of governments and ideologies and systems that would happily grind up millions of lives to achieve their goals. The war ended. Hart walked away from Boeing without looking back, returned to his canyon, to his forge and his garden and his handmade life. The experience hadn't changed his philosophy, it had confirmed it. By the mid-50s, Hart had perfected his world. The lodge was complete. The blacksmith shop was humming. The garden produced enough food to last through the 8-month winters. He had guns, tools, clothes, everything he needed. He was completely self-sufficient, completely free. And then the outside world came knocking. 1956. The US Forest Service, riding the wave of the new environmental movement, announced plans to designate a huge chunk of central Idaho as a primitive area, including Hart's home at 5 Mile Bar. Primitive area. Sounds nice, right? Protected wilderness. No development. Nature preserved for future generations. There was just one problem. The designation came with a rule. No permanent human habitation. After 24 years of back-breaking labour, after building a lodge and a forge and a garden and an irrigation system, after making his own guns and clothes and tools, after surviving winters that would have killed most men, after creating something that nobody else on Earth could have created, the government wanted to kick him out, turn his home back into empty wilderness, pretend he'd never been there at all. Hart's response was not to write a letter to his congressman. That's what a normal person would do. File a complaint, hire a lawyer, work within the system. Hart wasn't a normal person. He started building a tower, 3 stories tall, stone like his lodge, narrow slits for windows, positioned to command a perfect view of the river. The only practical approach to his property, gun slits. That's what those windows were. Not for looking out, for shooting through. He was building a fortress. The rangers started hearing about it. Some of them had been friendly with Hart, would stop by when they patrolled the area, drink tea from his samovar, listen to his stories. Now they were hearing he was building a gun tower and stockpiling weapons and telling anyone who'd listen that they'd have to kill him to get him out. He wasn't bluffing. At the same time, Cold War paranoia was running hot. Nuclear annihilation felt like a real possibility. People all over America were building bomb shelters in their backyards. Hart built one too, but not like the suburban versions with their thin concrete walls and 2 weeks of canned goods. He blasted his shelter out of solid rock, used dynamite he bought on one of his rare trips to town, spent months drilling holes, setting charges, hauling out rubble. The shelter could hold several people, had shelves for food and water, a ventilation shaft to the surface. This wasn't a precaution. This was preparation. For war. Against his own government, if it came to that. The man who'd rejected civilization, who'd walked away from everything modern life offered, was now preparing to fight to the death to keep what he'd built. Eventually the rangers came, motored up the Salmon River, faces grim. They'd seen the tower, heard the threats, come to assess the situation. What they found changed everything. They saw the lodge, the craftsmanship, the genius of the design. They saw the forge, the tools, the guns Hart had made with his own hands. They saw the garden, the irrigation system, the root cellar packed with preserved food. They saw a man who wasn't breaking any laws, who was living in harmony with the land, who wasn't hurting anyone or anything. And they saw the tower, the gun slits, the absolute unshakable determination in his eyes. This wasn't some crazy hermit squatting on public land. This was a sovereign individual, a king in his own kingdom, a man who had built something remarkable and would die before he let anyone take it away. The rangers made a decision, a wise decision probably, definitely the practical one. They backed down. The area got its wilderness designation, but an exception was made. Sylvan Hart could stay, could live out the rest of his days in the home he'd built with his own hands. The tower was never fired in anger, never had to be, but it stood there anyway, stone and determination, a statement to anyone who might think about messing with Buckskin Bill. Some things aren't for sale, some things aren't negotiable. Hart had drawn a line, and the United States government for once had decided not to cross it. Your bed is warm right now, comfortable, safe. Nobody's going to come take it away from you. But think about what it would feel like to build something with your own hands over decades, only to have someone in an office somewhere decide it wasn't yours anymore. Think about what you'd be willing to do to keep it. Sylvan Hart knew exactly what he was willing to do, and he made sure everyone else knew too. That's not paranoia. That's not craziness. That's freedom. The real kind. The kind you have to be willing to fight for. The standoff revealed something important about Hart. Something most people missed when they heard the story. He wasn't antisocial, wasn't hiding from people, wasn't some damaged soul who couldn't function around other humans. He was anti-dependence. Big difference. Hart actually liked people. Would talk for hours with anyone who made the journey to visit him. give them tours of his compound, show off his guns, his tools, his magnificent samovar, discuss history and politics and philosophy with astonishing depth, all while wearing his buckskins and that strange helmet. He wasn't a hermit in the traditional sense. He was a sovereign individual who happened to live alone, by choice. Not because he couldn't handle society, but because he didn't need it. The government backing down wasn't just a victory for Hart. It was validation. Proof that his way of life had value. That one man, living in harmony with the land, skilled enough to provide for himself completely, had rights worth respecting. The rangers who'd come to assess the situation ended up becoming regular visitors, would stop by on patrol, share a cup of tea, talk about the canyon, the wildlife, whatever was on their minds. They respected him. Hard not to once you saw what he'd built. Word spread through the Forest Service. There's this guy out in Hell's Canyon, makes his own guns, built his own house, faced down the whole agency and won. Some people thought he was crazy. Some thought he was a hero. Most just thought he was interesting. A living relic of a world that had mostly disappeared. Hart didn't care what they thought. He had his home, his work, his freedom. That was enough. The tower stood there for the rest of his life, never used for its intended purpose. Just a statement, a reminder. This is mine. I built it, and I'll defend it. After the confrontation, life settled back into its rhythm. Seasons came and went. The garden grew. The forge rang. The river flowed. Hart was in his 50s now, still strong, still sharp, but starting to feel the years in his bones. Winter mornings were harder. The cold seeped deeper, took longer to shake off, didn't slow him down much, just made him more careful, more deliberate. He developed routines over the decades, efficient patterns for everything he did. Rise with the sun, check the weather, the river, the garden. Breakfast simple, venison jerky, dried fruit, tea from his samovar, eaten standing, already planning the day's work, and there was always work. Spring meant planting and repairing winter damage. Summer meant tending the garden, fishing, maintaining the buildings. Fall was the frantic race to harvest and preserve and prepare. Winter was tool-making and leather work and reading by the dim light of his fish oil lamps. He worked in blocks, 2 hours at the forge, an hour in the garden, 3 hours on whatever construction project needed attention, an hour of hunting or checking traps. Switching tasks kept him fresh, kept the fatigue at bay. A man working alone can't afford to burn out. There's nobody to pick up the slack. He estimated he worked 12 to 14 hours a day, every day, for decades. Not because someone made him, not because he was chasing money or status or approval, because the work was the point. Modern people, Hart thought, had it backwards. They worked jobs they hated to buy things they didn't need to impress people they didn't like. Then they called the free time left over their real life. Hart's work was his real life. Every swing of the hammer, every seed planted, every hide tanned, every gun bored, it was all him, all his. He wasn't trading his time for money so he could buy manufactured happiness. He was building his life directly, hour by hour, day by day, year by year. That's why he never seemed tired of it, never seemed bitter or burned out. The work wasn't taken from him. It was added to him, making him more, making his world bigger and richer and more complete. Visitors would ask him about loneliness. Wasn't it hard being alone all the time? Didn't he miss people? Hart would shrug. There's a difference, he'd say, between being alone and being lonely. Lonely is when you need something you don't have, when there's a hole in your life that other people are supposed to fill. Hart didn't have that hole. His life was full of work and purpose and beauty, full of the satisfaction that comes from making things with your own hands, full of the peace that comes from knowing you can handle whatever comes. He had his books for intellectual companionship, had the animals of the canyon for company, the deer that wandered through his property, the eagles that soared overhead, the fish in the river, and increasingly he had visitors, river runners floating past, rangers on patrol, journalists who'd heard the legend and come to see for themselves. The world was changing out there. The 60s were coming. Counterculture, environmentalism, a generation questioning everything their parents had built. And suddenly, this old man in buckskin didn't seem so crazy anymore. Seemed almost prophetic. A man who'd seen the problems with modern life decades before anyone else, who'd found a solution and lived it. The rafters started coming in bigger numbers. The Salmon River was becoming a destination. Whitewater adventure, wilderness experience, disconnect from civilization for a few days. And right there on the river, at 5 Mile Bar, was the ultimate disconnection. A man who'd been off the grid since before there was a grid. Hart could have hidden from them, stayed in his cabin when the rafts floated by, guarded his solitude jealously. Instead, he did the opposite. He became a tourist attraction, would stand on his porch as the rafts approached, wave them over, offer tours of his compound, show off his creations, talk their ears off about everything from hide tanning to nuclear physics. He'd found something unexpected in his later years, an audience, all that knowledge, all those skills, all that philosophy. He'd spent decades developing it alone. Now he had people to share it with, and they listened. God, did they listen. Who wouldn't? Here was a man who'd actually done what most people only fantasized about. Left it all behind. Built something real. Lived on his own terms. He wasn't just surviving out here. He was thriving. Happy. Fulfilled. Maybe that was the most radical thing of all. Not the tower or the guns or the confrontation with the government. Just a man, alone in the wilderness, happy. That's what stuck with people. That's what they talked about when they got home. That's what made the legend grow. Buckskin Bill, the last of the mountain men, the guy who figured out something the rest of us are still trying to understand. Your pillow's soft. Your blankets are warm. You've probably got a phone within arm's reach that connects you to everyone you've ever known. Hart had none of that, and he was fine. Better than fine. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? What we're really chasing. What we actually need. Hart knew his answer. Lived it for 48 years. The rest of us are still working on ours. The rafters loved him. Couldn't get enough. They'd pull their boats up to the sandbar at 5 Mile Bar, and there he'd be, waiting on his porch, that ridiculous helmet on his head. Buckskin's immaculate despite decades of wear. Beard going red at the sides, white at the chin, straw-coloured at the tip, and he'd wave them over like old friends. Come on up, let me show you around. The tours became legendary on the river. You haven't really done the salmon, people would say, until you've had tea with Buckskin Bill. He'd start with the lodge, point out the construction details, how he'd quarried the stone, notched the logs, designed the whole thing for the temperature extremes. Visitors would run their hands over the walls, trying to wrap their heads around it. One man, hand tools, 2 years, then the forge. He'd explain how he built it, how the bellows worked, how he heated metal until it glowed and hammered it into shape. Sometimes he'd demonstrate, fire up the coals, work a piece of steel while they watched, sparks flying, hammer ringing, the smell of hot metal and wood smoke. The guns always got the biggest reaction. He'd hand them around carefully, let people feel the weight, sight down the barrels. He'd explain the boring process, the months of hand cranking, the precision required. And their faces would do this thing, this slow transformation from polite interest to genuine awe. You made this by hand, from scratch, every part, even the bullets. Then came the samovar and the tea. He'd serve them in cups he'd forged himself, seated in chairs he'd carved, and he'd talk. God, could that man talk. History, politics, philosophy, science, whatever was on his mind. He'd hold court like some wilderness professor, jumping from topic to topic, making connections nobody else would see. The fall of Rome and modern agriculture, nuclear physics and frontier survival, Kant's categorical imperative and how to tan a hide. People would sit there, tea going cold in their hands, just listening, forgetting they had a river to run, forgetting time was passing. He had opinions on everything, strong ones, would share them freely whether you asked or not. The Vietnam War was heating up in the 60s. Hart had thoughts, plenty of thoughts, would corner visitors and explain exactly what was wrong with the whole enterprise, not from a political angle, from a practical one. Systems, he'd say. It's always systems. Massive systems trying to control things they don't understand. Governments, armies, bureaucracies, all of them grinding up individual people to serve goals those people never agreed to. Same thing that happened in the oil fields during the Depression. Same thing that happens everywhere civilization gets too big for its britches. He wasn't bitter about it, more bemused, like he was watching children make the same mistakes over and over and couldn't understand why they didn't learn. The visitors ate it up. Here was a guy who'd actually opted out, actually walked away from all of it, and he seemed fine, better than fine, happy, fulfilled, living proof that you didn't have to play the game. Most of them would get back in their rafts eventually, float on down the river, return to their regular lives, jobs and mortgages and alarm clocks. But they'd remember. Years later, decades later, they'd still talk about that afternoon with Buckskin Bill, the tea, the guns, the way he looked at them like they were the strange ones, not him. He had this line he'd use, a favourite, about modern man trading his birthright for convenience, about being utterly dependent on systems that could fail. I chose differently, he'd finish. I chose to be free. Simple words. But coming from him, sitting in that lodge he'd built, wearing clothes he'd sewn, holding a cup he'd forged, they hit different. This wasn't theory. This was demonstration. His rare trips to town became the stuff of legend too. Once or twice a year, Hart would make the journey out. 40 miles through wilderness to the nearest settlement, a place called Bergdorf, Idaho. Summer population of about 6 people. He didn't go for supplies, not really. Made almost everything he needed himself. He went for 3 things: tea, books, gunpowder. Tea because he loved it, the ritual of it, the warmth, the moment of peace in the middle of a hard day. He could have done without, but didn't want to. Books because his mind was hungry, always hungry. No matter how many he'd read, there were more. History he hadn't learned, philosophy he hadn't considered, science that had advanced since his last visit. Gunpowder because you can't make it safely in a dirt floor shop. Some things are worth buying. He'd show up in town and it was like a celebrity appearance. People would come out just to see him. This wild man from the canyon, dressed in buckskin, that crazy helmet, beard down to his chest, and he'd pay for his purchases with gold dust. Panned it from the river himself. The salmon had gold. Not much, not enough to make mining worthwhile, but enough that a patient man could collect it over time. Hart would bring out these little leather pouches, count out the dust on a scale, and walk away with his tea and books and powder, like something out of the 1800s, which was exactly the point. The shopkeepers never knew quite what to make of him. Friendly enough, chatty, obviously intelligent, obviously not crazy, despite appearances, but so completely outside normal experience that they didn't have a category for him. He wasn't a tourist, wasn't a hunter, wasn't a prospector or a rancher or anything else that made sense. He was just Buckskin Bill, his own category, Population 1. In 1966, the wider world found out about him. Sports Illustrated sent a writer named Harold Peterson up the Salmon River. Peterson was chasing the same story everyone chased. The mountain man, the hermit, the guy living wild in the wilderness. He expected to find a character, some colourful eccentric who'd make good copy for a Sunday magazine. 2,000 words, a few photos, on to the next assignment. What he found was something else entirely. Peterson spent days with Hart, took the full tour, drank the tea, listened to the philosophy, watched him work the forge, examined the guns, walk the garden, explored the bomb shelter, and the story he wrote wasn't a character piece. It was a profile of a genius, a man who'd achieved something that seemed impossible, total self-sufficiency in the modern age. The Last of the Mountain Men, Peterson titled it. The article ran in October 1966 and hit like a bomb. Letters poured in from all over the country. People fascinated by this man who'd actually done what so many fantasized about. Actually walked away. Actually built something real. Hart became a national figure overnight. The symbol of something America was afraid it had lost. Rugged individualism, self-reliance, the ability to stand on your own 2 feet without anyone's help. The 60s were a strange time for that kind of message. On one hand, the counterculture was questioning everything, dropping out, seeking alternatives to mainstream society. On the other hand, the mainstream was more comfortable and dependent than ever. Suburbs, consumer goods, a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. Hart represented something different from both. Not a hippie commune with shared resources and fuzzy ideology. Not suburban conformity with its lawns and mortgages and keeping up with the Joneses. Just one man, making his own way, beholden to nothing and no one. The article didn't change his life much. A few more visitors, a few more questions. But he was already living exactly the way he wanted to live. Fame couldn't add anything to that. What it did change was his legacy. Before Peterson, Hart was a local legend, known on the river, in the small towns nearby, among the rangers who patrolled the wilderness. After Peterson, he was a national symbol, an idea as much as a person, proof that another way was possible. People started showing up with copies of the article, wanted him to sign them, wanted to shake his hand, wanted just to see, with their own eyes, that he was real. He'd oblige, graciously mostly, sign the articles, pose for photos, give the tours. But you could tell it amused him. All these people travelling hundreds of miles just to see a guy who'd made his own spoons. He'd joke about it with visitors. You came all this way to look at an old man in leather pants? Yeah, they'd say. We did? And he'd smile. That warm, genuine smile, and invite them in for tea. The funny thing about fame is it usually changes people, inflates egos, creates distance. makes them perform instead of just being. Hart never performed. Couldn't have if he'd tried. What you saw was what he was. A man who'd built an extraordinary life, happy to share it with anyone who showed up. No pretense, no affectation, just honesty. He'd tell visitors about the hard times, the winter that almost killed him, the frostbite, the loneliness that crept in sometimes, despite what he said about the difference between alone and lonely. He'd admit he wasn't perfect, had made mistakes, built things that didn't work, tried techniques that failed, wasted time and materials on dead ends. That's how you learn, he'd say, by getting it wrong and trying again, over and over until you get it right. The visitors loved that too, the honesty, the humanity. This wasn't some superhuman figure beyond normal comprehension. This was a regular person who decided to do something difficult and stuck with it long enough to succeed. That was the real lesson, maybe. Not that you needed superhuman abilities, just superhuman stubbornness. He had a soft spot for young people, the ones just starting out, still figuring out what their lives would be. Would take extra time with them, ask questions. What do you want to do? What matters to you? What are you willing to sacrifice to get it? Not preaching, just curious, and maybe hoping to plant a seed. The idea that you didn't have to follow the expected path, didn't have to take the job and buy the house and accumulate the stuff. You could choose something different, something harder maybe, but more yours. He never pushed it, never said everyone should live like him. That would have been ridiculous. Most people couldn't. Most people wouldn't want to. But for the ones who had that itch, that nagging feeling that something was missing, that modern life wasn't quite enough. For them, Hart was evidence. You can do this. It's possible. I did it. The sun would set over the canyon, the light turning everything gold as purple, the river going dark and silver. And Buckskin Bill would wave goodbye to the day's visitors, watch them float away downstream, return to his lodge and his books and his quiet evening routine. Another day, another set of faces, another round of questions and tours and tea. Tomorrow would bring more, or it wouldn't. Either way was fine. He had his home, his work, his freedom. What more could a person need? Your phone is probably within reach right now. You could check it, see what's happening in the world, what your friends are doing, what strangers think you should care about. Hart didn't have that, didn't want it. The world could spin without him just fine, and maybe, lying there in your comfortable bed, you're wondering what that would feel like, to be that disconnected, that self-contained, that free. It's a strange thought to fall asleep to, but a good one maybe. What would you keep? What would you let go? Hart figured out his answer, lived it for 48 years. The rest of us get to wonder. There were stories he'd tell, over and over to different visitors, polished smooth like river stones from repetition. The rattlesnake bite was a favourite. 38. Out checking traps. Reached into a rock pile without looking. Felt the strike before he saw the snake. 2 puncture marks on his ankle, already swelling. 40 miles from help. No phone, no radio. Just him and whatever he could find in the canyon. He made a tourniquet from his belt. Cut open the bite with his knife. Let it bleed. Mixed up a poultice from wild herbs he knew were supposed to draw out poison. Wrapped it tight and waited. 3 days of fever. Hallucinations. Sweating through his buckskins. Talking to people who weren't there. His body fighting something his mind couldn't help with. And then, slowly, the fever broke. The swelling went down. He lived. Visitors would ask how he stayed so calm. how he didn't panic, didn't try to hike out for help. What good would panic do, he'd say. You deal with what's in front of you. Figure out the problem, apply what you know, and accept that some things are out of your hands. That was Hart in a nutshell. Practical to the bone. No time for drama or self-pity, just solutions. He had a sense of humour too, dry as canyon dust. A woman once asked him what he'd do if he broke his leg out in the woods somewhere. Miles from home. No way to get help. Hart didn't miss a beat. "Ma'am," he said, "we don't get broken legs around here." She didn't know what to make of that. Neither did anyone else. Was he joking? Being serious? Making some philosophical point about will and determination? All of the above, probably. That was his style. He'd poke fun at civilization, at all the things modern people thought they needed. Once told a visitor, 5 Mile Bar is the only place on the river with good firewood. You know why? Because there's never been a woman here. A woman sits around the stove all day burning fuel. Terrible thing to say. Sexist as hell. He knew it too. You could see the twinkle in his eye when he said it. Waiting for the reaction. Enjoying the discomfort. Old men get away with saying things like that. Especially old men in buckskin who make their own guns and fought off the federal government. He had opinions about Thoreau too. Everyone compared him to Thoreau. The simple life. Walden Pond. Back to nature. Hart would scoff at that. Thoreau didn't stay at Walden long enough to really learn his job, he'd say. 2 years, 2 months, 2 days. What's that? A camping trip. Try doing it for 40 years. Then we'll talk. Harsh? Maybe. But he had a point. Thoreau was experimenting, trying something out, always knowing he could go back to civilization whenever he wanted. Hart had burned his bridges, literally in some ways. This wasn't an experiment. This was his life. He never got tired of the questions, even the stupid ones, even the same ones he'd answered 1,000 times before. Why did you come here? How do you survive the winters? Don't you miss people? What do you do for fun? He'd answer patiently. Every time, like it was the first time anyone had asked. Maybe he understood that these questions mattered to the people asking them, that they were really asking about themselves, about their own lives, their own choices. Could I do this? Would I want to? What am I missing that makes this kind of a life seem so appealing? Hart was a mirror. People looked at him and saw their own longings reflected back. The ones who were happy with their lives saw an interesting oddity, a character, someone to tell stories about back home. The ones who weren't happy saw something else, a possibility, a door they didn't know existed. Hart was careful with those ones. The dreamers, the searchers. He didn't want to sell them a fantasy. This life is hard, he'd tell them, harder than you can imagine from the outside. Most people couldn't do it. Most people wouldn't want to if they really understood what it meant. But if it's in you, if you've got that itch that won't go away, then yeah, it's possible. I'm proof. Just know what you're getting into, and be honest with yourself about why you want it. Good advice, from a man who'd lived it. The evenings were his favourite time, after the visitors left, after the day's work was done. He'd sit on his porch and watch the light fade, the canyon walls going through their colour changes, gold to orange to purple to black. Sometimes he played his flute, the river cane one he'd carved himself, simple melodies drifting over the water, mixing with the sound of the river and the wind in the trees. He sang too, folk songs he remembered from somewhere, songs in languages most visitors couldn't identify, German, Norwegian, Spanish. terrible voice. Everyone agreed on that, like a gate that needed oiling. But he sang anyway, because he could, because there was no one to impress, because music was one of those human things that didn't require an audience. The stars would come out, thick and bright in a way they never are near cities, so many that they cast shadows, so clear you could see the arm of the galaxy stretching across the sky. Hart would sit there and look up. Same stars his ancestors looked at. Same stars that would still be there long after he was gone. Perspective. That's what the canyon gave him. A sense of scale. Human problems seemed smaller out here. Human achievements too. All the things people worried about, fought over, killed for, tiny, temporary. Barely a ripple in the vast indifference of the universe. But that wasn't depressing. It was freeing. You didn't have to matter to the universe. You just had to matter to yourself. Hart mattered to himself. His work mattered. His home mattered. The life he'd built stone by stone, tool by tool, skill by skill. That was enough. More than enough. The river kept flowing. The stars kept turning. And Buckskin Bill kept living his impossible, improbable, perfectly ordinary, extraordinary life. One day at a time, one task at a time, one cup of tea at a time. Your eyes might be getting heavy now. Your thoughts starting to drift. That's okay. Let them drift. Think about the canyon, the dark water, the stone walls rising up, the stars above. Think about a man sitting on his porch, playing a flute he carved himself, perfectly at peace. That's what freedom looks like. Not excitement, not adventure, just peace, hard-won and deeply held. Maybe that's worth dreaming about. The years kept passing, the way they do. Hart turned 60, then 65, then 70. The canyon didn't care. The river kept flowing. The seasons kept turning. Winter still came hard and stayed long. His body felt it now. The cold mornings were harder, took longer to get moving. His hands, those miraculous hands that had forged 1,000 tools and bored rifle barrels to impossible precision, weren't as steady as they used to be. But he kept working. What else was there to do? The forge still rang. The garden still grew. The fish still swam into his traps. Life went on. Slower maybe, but no less full. He'd developed shortcuts over the decades, little efficiencies that saved energy, ways of doing things that a younger man wouldn't think to use because a younger man didn't need to. He'd learned to let gravity do more work, positioning things so they'd roll or slide where he needed them instead of carrying, using leverage instead of brute force, working smarter because he couldn't always work harder. That's what experience gives you. Not just knowledge, but wisdom. The difference between what you can do and what you should do. He adapted. That's what survivors do. The heavy work got spread out over more days. A project that might have taken a week when he was 40 now took 2. So what? He had time. Time was the one resource the canyon never ran out of. He started keeping better records, notes on what worked, what didn't, which plants did best in which spots, how long different tasks took, writing it down because memory wasn't as reliable as it used to be. The cabin walls were covered with his handwriting, calculations, observations, reminders. 40 years of accumulated wisdom, scribbled in pencil and charcoal wherever there was space. He taught himself to pace, not to start big jobs in the afternoon when energy was low, to save the precision work for mornings when his hands were steadiest, to rest before he was exhausted instead of after. Simple stuff, obvious maybe, but the kind of obvious that takes decades to really learn. Visitors noticed he moved differently, more deliberate, more careful. But they also noticed he still moved, still worked, still produced. A man of 70, alone in the wilderness, maintaining a compound that would have exhausted a team of 20-somethings. That's something. The knowledge he'd accumulated was staggering when you tried to add it up. Consider what he knew, really knew, not read about once, not heard somewhere, actually understood deeply from years of practice. Geology. He could look at a rock and tell you what it was made of, how it formed, whether it would work for building or smelting or sharpening tools. The canyon walls were a textbook he'd been reading for 40 years. Metallurgy. The behaviour of iron and steel and copper and brass under heat and stress. How to temper a blade. How to case harden a surface. How different alloys responded to the hammer. Knowledge that used to take years of apprenticeship passed down from master smiths. Botany. Every plant in the canyon. Edible, medicinal, poisonous, useful. Which ones made good dye? Which ones yielded fibres for rope? Which ones would soothe a burn or settle a stomach? Which ones would kill you? Zoology. Animal behaviour. Migration patterns. Bedding habits. How to read tracks. How to predict where game would be and when. The difference between hunting and just walking around in the woods hoping to get lucky. Hydrology. Water flow. Erosion patterns. Where springs emerged and why. How to divert water, store it, use it. The engineering of irrigation in a place that didn't want to be irrigated. Architecture. Load-bearing principles. Insulation. Ventilation. How to build for heat and cold and wind and rain. How to make structures that lasted instead of structures that rotted. Chemistry. The reactions involved in tanning leather, preserving food, making soap, treating wounds, a practical chemistry, not from textbooks, but from necessity. Ballistics. The physics of projectiles, barrel rifling, powder charges, bullet weight and velocity, the math of hitting what you aimed at from hundreds of yards away, and woven through all of it, the practical stuff that doesn't have a name. How to sharpen a blade, how to tie knots that held, how to start a fire in the rain, how to stay warm when it's 40 below, how to not go crazy when you're alone for months. Each piece of knowledge connected to every other piece. That was the thing outsiders missed. He didn't learn these skills in isolation. They formed a system, an ecology of competence where everything supported everything else. The hunting fed the tanning. The tanning provided leather for bellows. The bellows powered the forge. The forge made tools. The tools built the garden. The garden grew food. The food gave energy for hunting. Round and round, each skill making the others possible. Break one link and the whole chain suffered. Master them all and you had something self-sustaining, something complete. That's what Hart had built. Not just a homestead, a complete human ecosystem. One man containing within himself all the knowledge needed to survive and thrive without any external input. The achievement was almost incomprehensible from the outside. We're so specialised now. Know one thing deeply, maybe two. Depend on others for everything else. Hart was the opposite. A generalist in an age of specialists. A whole civilization compressed into a single skull. He'd joke about it sometimes. Tell visitors he was the most dangerous man they'd ever meet. Not because of the guns, though there were plenty of those. Because he didn't need anything from anyone. You can't threaten a man like that. Can't pressure him. Can't control him. What are you going to do? Take away his Netflix subscription? He had nothing to lose that he couldn't rebuild. And he knew how to rebuild everything. That's power. Real power. Not the kind that comes from money or position or connections, the kind that comes from competence so deep it can't be taken away. The river brought new faces every summer, the same questions, the same amazement, the same photos and handshakes and promises to come back someday. Most never did. Life got busy. The canyon seemed farther away once you were back in civilization. The lessons learned there faded into memory, then into stories, then into vague feelings you couldn't quite name. But some came back, year after year, became something like friends. Hart welcomed them, remembered their names, asked about their families, followed up on things they'd told him the year before. For a hermit, he had a pretty good social life, just concentrated into a few months of summer when the river was navigable and the weather was kind. The rest of the year he was alone, and that was fine. He'd made his peace with solitude long ago. Winter was the test, always had been. But it was different now. When you're young, winter is an enemy to fight. You rage against the cold, push through the short days, count the weeks until spring like a prisoner counting days until release. When you're old, winter is a companion. You settle into it, accept its rhythms, sleep more, work less, read by lamplight and let the dark hours pass without fighting them. Hart had learned to love winter in a way, the forced slowness of it, the excuse to sit and think, the world outside frozen and quiet, the world inside warm and still. He'd spend whole evenings just watching the fire, not reading, not planning, just watching the flames dance and listening to the wood pop and letting his mind wander wherever it wanted to go. Memories mostly, the oil fields, his family, the first winter here when he almost died, all the years since. A man who lives alone has time to know himself. Hart knew himself better than most people ever would. The good parts, the bad parts, the parts he'd never tell anyone. Nights in the canyon were absolute. No light pollution, no distant hum of traffic, just darkness so complete you could almost touch it. Hart would read by his fish oil lamps until his eyes got tired. Then he'd sit in the dark and think, or not think, just exist, present in a way that modern life doesn't allow. No notifications, no feeds, no constant stream of information demanding attention, just silence and darkness and the sound of the river. He'd think about the past sometimes, the oil fields, the war, the years of building, all the winters he'd survived, all the tools he'd made, all the visitors who'd come and gone. He'd think about the future too. Not much of it left, probably. He was realistic about that. 70 years old, living alone, doing hard physical labour every day. The actuarial tables weren't in his favour, but he wasn't afraid. What was there to fear? He'd lived more fully than most people dream of. Built something with his own hands that would outlast him, proved something that needed proving. Death was just another problem to be dealt with when it came. Like winter, like floods, like rattlesnakes. You prepare what you can, accept what you can't, and you don't waste time worrying about things you can't control. That was the canyon's wisdom. The lesson it taught if you stayed long enough to learn. Everything ends. Rivers dry up. Mountains erode. Stars burn out. You live for a while and then you don't. The question isn't how to avoid that. The question is what to do with the time you have. Hart knew his answer. Had known it since 1932 when he walked into this canyon with an axe and $1 and a head full of dreams. Build something. Make something. Leave something behind that matters. Not fame, not fortune, just evidence. Proof that you were here, that you did something, that you mattered, even if only to yourself. The lodge would stand for decades after he was gone. The forge would still be there. The tools, the guns, the samovar. Physical objects carrying the imprint of his hands, his mind, his will. That was immortality enough. He gargles with rum every morning. Did you know that? 151 proof Hudson's Bay Company rum. The stuff that won the North, he called it. Not drinking it. Just gargling. Said it kept the germs away. Killed anything that might be trying to set up shop in his throat. Probably nonsense. Probably just an old man's superstition. But he'd never been seriously sick in 40 years, so who's to say? He had these little rituals, things that seemed eccentric but made sense if you thought about them. Never took a bath when he could help it. Said bathing washed away the natural oils your skin needed, made you more vulnerable to the elements. Sounds crazy. But his skin was healthy, his hair was thick, and he spent his life outdoors in brutal conditions without developing the problems you'd expect. Maybe he was onto something. Maybe it was just genetics. Maybe the rum killed everything, including the bad effects of not bathing. Hard to say. The sample size was 1. He wore that helmet everywhere, the Swiss Guard thing. People thought it was affectation, costume, playing a part. It wasn't. It was engineering. Wide brim for sun, ear flaps for wind, insulated crown for cold, every element serving a purpose. Looking strange was just a side effect of looking functional. Form follows function. The modernist architects said that. Hart lived it without knowing the slogan. His compound had grown over the years, started with just the dugout that first winter, then the lodge, then the forge, then outbuildings and storage sheds and the smokehouse and the root cellar. Now it was almost a village. A one-man village, but still. Structures arranged around a central area. Paths worn into the ground from decades of footsteps. A geography shaped by one person's needs and habits. He knew every inch of it. Could walk it blindfolded. Knew which boards creaked and which stones were loose, and where to step when the ground was muddy. The land knew him too, in a way. Had adapted to his presence. The garden soil enriched by 40 years of composting. The fish runs predictable after decades of observation. The wildlife patterns shaped around his movements. Man and place had merged into something neither could have been alone. That's what happens when you stay somewhere long enough. You stop being a visitor, stop being a resident even. You become part of the landscape itself. Time moved differently here. That was something visitors never understood. In the city, time is a resource, something to spend, something to save, something always running out. People talk about killing time like it's an enemy. In the canyon, time just was. It flowed like the river. You couldn't speed it up or slow it down. You could only move with it or fight against it, and fighting was pointless. Hart had stopped fighting decades ago. Let the days be what they were. Long in summer, short in winter, fast when he was busy, slow when he wasn't. He didn't own a watch, hadn't for years. The sun told him what he needed to know. The seasons told him the rest. There's a freedom in that, letting go of the constant measurement, not knowing exactly what time it is because it doesn't really matter. Morning, afternoon, evening, night, that's enough. That's all anybody really needs. Hart was as much a feature of Hell's Canyon as the river or the rocks, would be remembered that way. The man who lived at 5 Mile Bar, part of the place's identity. The tourists who floated past were seeing something that wouldn't come again. A living piece of history, last representative of a way of life that was already ancient when their grandparents were born. They knew it too. You could see it in their faces. The awareness that this was special, that they were witnessing something that would only exist once. Made the tea taste better, made the stories hit harder, made the whole experience feel sacred somehow. Not religious sacred, human sacred. The recognition of something rare and valuable and temporary. Hart would be gone someday. Everyone knew it. Even Hart knew it. But not yet. Not tonight. Tonight he's still there, sitting on his porch, watching the stars, listening to the river, still alive, still free, still exactly where he wants to be. Your breathing is probably slower now, your body heavier in the bed. That's good. Let it be heavy. Think about the river, dark water flowing south, the sound of it, constant and rhythmic, like a heartbeat, like breathing. Think about the stars, uncountable, unimaginably distant, burning away in the dark. Think about an old man on a porch at peace with everything. That's a good image to carry into sleep. Just peace, just stillness, just being exactly where you are. 1979 came and went. Hart turned 73. The winters were harder now, not because they'd changed, because he had. Getting out of bed took longer. The cold settled into his joints and didn't want to leave. His heart, that enlarged heart that had kept him out of combat in 42, was working harder than it used to. He knew what was coming, wasn't stupid about it. When you live alone in the wilderness, you develop a pretty clear-eyed view of mortality. No illusions, no false hope. But he kept working. What else was there? The garden still needed tending. The forge still needed firing. The fish trap still needed checking. The routines that had structured his life for nearly 50 years didn't stop just because he was tired. That spring was beautiful. The canyon exploded with wildflowers the way it did every year. Purple lupine, yellow balsam root, white yarrow scattered through the grass like stars. Hart walked his property and took it in. The way the light hit the river in the morning. The way the walls changed colour through the day. The sounds he'd been hearing so long they'd become part of him. He'd seen almost 50 springs here. This one felt different somehow. Sharper. More vivid. Like his eyes were trying to memorise everything. The rafters started coming in early June. First trickle of the season, then more, then the steady stream that would continue until September. Hart greeted them the way he always did, waved from his porch, invited them up, gave the tours, served the tea, told the stories, same stories he'd told for years, but he told them well, each time like the first time, each visitor getting the full performance. They didn't know it would be the last season. How could they? He looked the same, sounded the same, still wore the buckskins, still had that ridiculous helmet, still showed off the guns and the forge and the samovar with obvious pride, maybe a little slower, maybe a little more tired by the end of the day, but still himself, still Buckskin Bill. The summer passed, the crowds thinned. September brought the first hints of fall colour to the canyon walls. Hart prepared for winter the way he always did. Harvested the garden, smoked the fish, stacked the firewood, checked the lodge for repairs that needed doing. The work was harder this year. He had to stop more often, rest more, let tasks stretch over days that used to take hours, but he got it done. 48 winters he'd prepared for. This would be 49. October came. The last rafters of the season floated past. Hart waved goodbye and watched them disappear around the bend. Then silence. The deep canyon silence he knew better than any sound. Just him and the river and the approaching winter. November brought the first snow. December brought the deep cold. The canyon settled into its frozen sleep, and Hart settled into his winter routine, reading by lamplight, working leather by the fire, maintaining tools that didn't need maintaining because there was nothing else to do. The isolation was complete now. No way in or out until spring, just like every other winter. He was alone with his thoughts and his books and the endless work of staying alive. Some nights he'd think about the life he'd lived, the choices he'd made, whether it had all been worth it. The answer was always yes. Not because the life had been easy. It hadn't. Not because he'd achieved fame or fortune. He hadn't wanted those things. It was worth it because it was his. Every minute of it. Every decision. Every success and failure. All his. How many people could say that? Really say it? That they'd lived the life they chose rather than the life that happened to them? Not many. Hart knew that. Counted himself lucky. The winter deepened. January came with its bitter cold. February worse. Hart moved through his days like he always had. Slowly now. Carefully. Conserving energy. His heart was struggling. He could feel it. The irregular beats. The shortness of breath when he did too much. The fatigue that never quite went away. The nights were long. Longer than they used to seem. He'd lie in bed listening to the wind howl outside and think about all the other nights he'd spent in this room. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. The same walls. The same ceiling. The same sounds. But different now. Everything felt different when you knew the end was close. He wrote letters that winter. To his sisters. To a few friends. Nothing dramatic. Just catching up. Sharing news. The kind of letters that don't say goodbye but mean it anyway. He organised his papers too, made sure everything was in order, the deed to the property, records of what he'd built and when, instructions in a way for whoever came after. Not that he expected anyone to continue his life here. That was his alone. But the place itself could go on, should go on. It meant something. He didn't fight the dying, didn't rail against it, just accepted it the way he'd accepted everything else the canyon threw at him. This was how it would end, alone, in the place he loved, on his own terms. He could think of worse ways to go. March brought the first thaw. The ice on the river started breaking up. The days got longer. Hart felt a little better, the way you do when winter loosens its grip, a little more energy, a little more hope. He started planning the spring garden, what he'd plant, where he'd put things, the same plans he'd made 48 times before. April came. The canyon was waking up, birds returning, flowers starting to push through the last of the snow. The 29th was a Tuesday. Nice day. Warm for April. The kind of day that made you glad to be alive. Hart woke up, had his tea, looked out at the river the way he did every morning. Then he went back to bed, just for a rest, just to close his eyes for a while, and that was it. He died in his sleep, in his stone lodge, surrounded by his books and his tools. The samovar in the kitchen, cold now. The forge outside, quiet. No pain, no struggle, no drama. Just a man reaching the end of a long journey and lying down to rest. He wasn't found right away. It was early season. The rafters hadn't really started yet. A river guide came by in early May. Regular stop, part of the routine. The guide had known Hart for years, brought groups by every season, looked forward to seeing the old man. He noticed the smoke wasn't rising from the chimney, noticed the door was closed in a way it usually wasn't, noticed that Hart hadn't come out to the porch to wave, the porch where he always stood, that distinctive silhouette, The buckskins, the helmet, the raised hand, empty now. Just wooden planks and silence. Something wrong. You could feel it. The guide tied up his boat and climbed the bank. The compound felt different. Still. The forge cold. The garden unplanted. Tools sitting where they'd been left months ago. The guide went up to the lodge, knocked. No answer. Called out. Nothing. He pushed open the door. The smell hit him first. Not decay. Not yet. Just closeness. The smell of a space that hadn't been aired out in weeks. Hart was in his bed, still in his buckskins, peaceful, like he was sleeping. But he wasn't sleeping. You could tell. Something about the stillness, the absolute absence of movement. The guide stood there for a long moment, taking it in. The end of an era. The last of the mountain men gone. The room was neat, organised, books stacked on the shelf, tools hanging in their places, the samovar visible through the doorway to the kitchen. Everything exactly as Hart would have wanted it. Ready for visitors who would never hear his voice. The guide backed out slowly, closed the door, walked back to his boat in a kind of daze. Then he radioed for help, the words feeling strange in his mouth. Buckskin Bill is dead. Word spread fast, up and down the river, through the small towns, among the rangers and the guides and everyone who'd known him. Buckskin Bill was dead. People reacted the way people do. Shock first, then sadness, then the slow acceptance that comes with any death, even an expected one. He'd lived 73 years, 48 of them in the canyon. By any measure, a full life, a remarkable life. But still, the world felt a little emptier without him in it. There was no funeral. Hart wouldn't have wanted one. No gravestone either. No marker saying, "Here lies Sylvan Hart." That wasn't his style. He was cremated. Simple, efficient, no ceremony. His ashes came back to the canyon, back to 5 Mile Bar, back to the only place that had ever really been home. Someone walked the property with the urn, scattered him in the garden he'd tended for 48 years, by the forge where he'd made his tools, along the river bank where he'd fished, near the lodge where he'd lived and died. Just like that, he became part of it, mixed with the soil and the rock and the water, part of 5 Mile Bar forever, inseparable from the land he'd worked so hard to master. His sisters came later, made the long journey to see where their brother had lived, to understand finally what he'd been doing all those years. They walked through the lodge, touched the walls he'd built, looked at the things he'd made, the life he'd chosen over family, over society, over everything they understood as normal. What did they think? Hard to say. Pride, probably. Bewilderment, too. How could someone they'd grown up with, someone they'd known as a child, have become this? They collected what they wanted. Personal items, photos from his youth, letters he'd written over the decades, small things that connected him to the life before the canyon. His nephew inherited the property, the lodge, the forge, the tools, the guns, everything Hart had built over nearly 5 decades. The question was what to do with it. You couldn't just leave it. The canyon would reclaim it eventually. Weather and time breaking down what one man had built. You couldn't sell it either. Not really. Who would buy it? Who would want to live the way Hart had lived? The answer came slowly, over months of discussion and planning. The place would become a museum, a memorial, a testament to what one person could achieve. Not a dusty museum with ropes and signs telling you not to touch. A living museum, where you could walk through the lodge and see where he slept, where you could touch the tools he'd made, where you could understand, in some small way, what his life had been. The Forest Service got involved. The same agency that had once tried to evict him. Irony thick enough to cut. But times had changed. People had changed. Hart wasn't a problem anymore. He was a treasure. A piece of American history that deserved protecting. In 2019, they made it official. 5 Mile Bar became a registered historic site. Protected now, preserved. The same wilderness designation that had once threatened him now guarding his legacy. Buckskin Bill would have laughed at that. Probably did laugh. Wherever he was, the idea felt right. Hart had always welcomed visitors, had always wanted to show people what he'd built. What better legacy than continuing that tradition? Work began. Careful work. Preserving what needed preserving. Stabilizing what needed stabilizing. Making sure this place would last another 50 years, another 100. The guides started including it on their tours again. But different now. Not a visit with a living legend. A pilgrimage to where a legend had lived. People came, a lot of people. More than when Hart was alive, actually. They walked through his lodge, marvelled at the construction, ran their hands over stone walls he'd laid himself. They stood in his forge, looked at the anvil worn smooth from decades of use, imagined the ring of hammer on steel. They examined his guns, those impossible, beautiful, functional works of art, still in perfect condition, still capable of firing if someone loaded them. The barrels he'd bored by hand, the stocks he'd carved, the mechanisms he'd forged, each one a masterpiece, each one a declaration that human hands could still make beautiful things. Collectors had offered fortunes for these guns over the years. Hart had always refused. What good was money to him? What could he buy that he couldn't make? Now they belonged to the museum, to history, to anyone who made the journey to see them. They looked at the samovar, tried to comprehend how a man who'd never seen one could make something so intricate, so perfect. 3 feet of hammered copper and brass, every curve deliberate, every joint precise. A Russian tea service in the American wilderness made from scraps and dreams. It still worked. Someone had tested it. Heated water in that elegant central chamber. Drawn tea from the spigot. The same ritual Hart had performed thousands of times. And they thought about him. This strange, brilliant, stubborn man who'd done what they couldn't imagine doing. What drove him? What kept him going? What did he know that they didn't? The answers were there, in the things he'd left behind, in the lodge and the forge and the garden, in the stories people told about him. He knew that freedom wasn't free. It cost everything, but it was worth the price. He knew that skills were wealth, real wealth, the kind no one could take away. He knew that a life built with your own hands meant something deep, something permanent. He knew that you didn't need much to be happy, just work that mattered and a place to call home. Simple lessons, hard to learn, harder to live. But he'd lived them for 48 years, proved they were possible. That's what the visitors came to see. Not just a museum, proof. Evidence that another way existed. The canyon's still there. The river still flows. If you go there today, you can see what he built, touch what he made, stand where he stood. It's different now, of course. He's not there to greet you, not there to serve tea and tell stories. But something of him remains, in the stones, in the tools, in the land itself. Some people say they can feel him, a presence, not a ghost exactly, just something. The echo of a life lived fully. Maybe they're imagining it, maybe not. Either way, the place feels sacred, set apart from ordinary life, a temple to self-reliance. Your eyes are probably heavy now, your thoughts slowing down. That's okay. Let them slow. Think about the canyon at night, dark and quiet, the river murmuring, the stars thick overhead. Think about a lodge standing empty, waiting, holding the memory of the man who built it. Think about peace, hard-earned peace, the kind that comes from knowing you did what you set out to do. That's worth something, worth remembering, worth carrying into sleep. So what did he prove? That's the question that hangs over everything. 48 years, 200,000 hours of labour, a lifetime of solitude and struggle and hard-won satisfaction. What was the point? Here's what I think, and you can disagree. You're lying in bed, almost asleep. You're allowed to disagree. He proved that total self-sufficiency wasn't a myth, wasn't a fantasy, wasn't something from a bygone era that modern people couldn't achieve. One person, with enough knowledge, enough skill, enough stubbornness, could actually do it, could actually build a life that depended on nothing and no one. For nearly 50 years, Sylvan Hart lived without electricity, without running water, without a telephone, without a grocery store, without a single tool he hadn't made himself or carefully chosen. He wasn't surviving, he was thriving, building beautiful things, reading great books, thinking deep thoughts, living fully in a way most of us never manage. That's remarkable. That's worth remembering. But here's the harder question, the one that might keep you awake if you think about it too much. What have we lost? Not what did Hart have that we don't. That's obvious. Skills, knowledge, independence, the ability to make things with his hands. But what have we traded away? What did we give up to get the lives we have now? Think about it. How many things do you own that you could make yourself? Not assemble from a kit. Actually make from raw materials, with your own hands. For most of us, the answer is close to zero. Maybe you could bake bread. Maybe you could sew a button. Maybe you could change a tyre if someone walked you through it. But clothes, shelter, tools, weapons, medicine, food beyond the very basics. We've outsourced all of it. Every human need that kept our ancestors busy, we've handed off to specialists. And in exchange, we got convenience, we got free time, we got the ability to focus on other things. Art, science, entertainment, whatever we want. That's not nothing. That's actually pretty great in a lot of ways. But Hart saw something we don't like to look at. The cost of all that convenience, dependence, total dependence. On systems we don't understand, on people we'll never meet, on supply chains that stretch around the world. Your food comes from somewhere, your clothes come from somewhere, your heat and light and water and shelter all depend on complex systems functioning correctly. Think about it honestly. Your phone, made of rare earth minerals mined in countries you'll never visit, assembled in factories you'll never see, powered by electricity generated miles away. Your water, pumped through pipes laid by people long dead, treated with chemicals you can't pronounce, delivered by pressure systems that require constant maintenance. Your food, grown in fields you've never walked, harvested by machines or hands you've never shaken, trucked across highways you rarely think about, sold in stores that look the same in every city. None of this is your doing. All of it could stop tomorrow. If those systems fail, what do you do? What can you do? Hart knew the answer. Nothing. You do nothing. You wait and hope someone fixes things before you starve or freeze or die of thirst. That's not a criticism. Not really. The systems work most of the time. The lights come on, the water flows, the shelves stay stocked. But there's a fragility there, a vulnerability we don't like to think about. Hart thought about it. Couldn't stop thinking about it. Back in 32, watching the systems fail all around him, watching men who'd done everything right lose everything anyway. He decided he wouldn't be at the mercy of forces he couldn't control, wouldn't trust his survival to strangers and systems and luck. He called it trading your birthright for convenience, giving up the fundamental human ability to provide for yourself in exchange for comfort. Was he right? I don't know. Maybe the trade was worth it. Maybe specialization and interdependence are just better, more efficient, more productive, better for everyone. But maybe something got lost in the exchange, some essential human capacity that we used to have and don't anymore. Hart kept it, cultivated it, proved it could still exist in the modern world. That's his legacy. Not the lodge or the forge or the guns, the proof, the demonstration that another way was possible. We talk about off-grid living now. It's a movement, a trend. People spend tens of thousands of dollars on solar panels and composting toilets to achieve a fraction of the independence Hart built for himself with $1 and a lifetime of hard work. We celebrate maker culture, 3D printers, CNC machines, YouTube tutorials on how to build things. Hart did it with a hammer and an anvil and fire. No tutorials, no forums, no community of fellow enthusiasts trading tips. Just one man figuring it out, failing and trying again, getting it wrong until he got it right. The real genius wasn't any single skill. Not the gunsmithing or the gardening or the blacksmithing or the leather work. It was the system, the way everything connected to everything else. Hunting fed tanning. Tanning made bellows. Bellows powered the forge made tools. Tools built the garden grew food. Food gave energy for hunting, round and round, each skill supporting every other skill, each piece of knowledge unlocking new possibilities. Break one link and the whole chain suffers. Master them all and you have something self-sustaining, something complete. That's what he built. A complete human ecosystem. One man containing within himself all the knowledge needed to survive and thrive without any external input. We're specialists now. Know one thing deeply, maybe two. Depend on others for everything else. Hart was the opposite. A generalist in an age of specialists. A whole civilization compressed into a single skull. You don't have to live like he did. Almost nobody could. Almost nobody would want to. But knowing that it's possible, that one person actually did it, that changes something. Opens a door in your mind that was closed before. Maybe you'll never walk through that door. Most people won't. But it's there, thanks to him. The canyon is quiet tonight. Or it would be, if you were there. Just the river. The endless murmur of water over stone. A sound that's been the same for longer than humans have existed. The wind moves through the cottonwoods. Soft rustling. Like whispered conversation in a language you almost understand. Animals move in the darkness. Deer picking their way along familiar trails. Owls gliding silent overhead. The quick scurry of smaller things through the underbrush, and above it all, the stars, thick and bright the way they are only in truly dark places, the Milky Way stretching across the sky like a river of light. The same stars Hart watched for 48 years. The lodge still stands, dark now, empty, but solid. Built to last by a man who understood that nothing lasts forever, but some things last longer than others. The stone walls hold the cold at night, release it slowly through the day, still working, still doing what they were designed to do. The windows are dark, no lamplight flickering, no shadow moving behind the glass, but the structure remains, waiting, patient. The forge is cold, the anvil waiting for a hammer that will never swing again. But they're there. Physical evidence, proof. The garden has been maintained. A couple lives nearby now, caretakers. They tend the soil Hart enriched with 48 years as composting. Plant vegetables in the terraces he built. The seeds he saved still produce. His strains, adapted over decades to this specific canyon, this specific soil, this specific climate. Something of him lives on in those plants, in the genetic memory of seeds he selected year after year, choosing the strongest, discarding the weak, creating something perfectly suited to its place. The guns are still there too, in the museum now, behind glass, but still functional, still beautiful. Someone could pick them up and shoot them if they wanted to. They'd fire true. After all these years, that's craftsmanship, that's care, that's the kind of quality that comes from giving a damn about what you make. We don't build things like that anymore, not usually. We build things to be replaced, things with planned obsolescence, things that work for a while and then break so you have to buy new ones. Hart built things to last, because he had to, because replacing things wasn't an option, because the only tools he'd have were the ones he made so they'd better work. Different incentives create different results. The samovar is probably the most photographed thing in the museum. Visitors can't get over it. This elaborate, ornate, beautiful thing, made from scraps, by a man who'd never seen the real article. It sits in the kitchen where he left it. Cold now. No steam rising from the spout. No tea warming in the pot on top. But still elegant. Still graceful. Still a testament to what human hands can do when they're guided by human imagination. Art, he called it. Making sure you have good utensils first. Things you use every day. Before you go fooling with pictures. Practical art. Functional beauty. The Scandinavian idea, he said. Though he was American through and through. You're probably drifting now, half asleep, half dreaming. That's okay. That's good. Let me leave you with this. Somewhere in Idaho, in the deepest canyon in North America, there's a place where one man built a world, stone by stone, tool by tool, day by day, for almost 50 years. He didn't do it to prove anything, didn't do it for fame or money or recognition, did it because it was what he wanted, because it was who he was, and in doing it, he showed the rest of us something we'd forgotten, that human beings are capable of extraordinary things when they commit to them, that self-reliance isn't just a slogan, that freedom has a price, but it might be worth paying. He's gone now, has been for more than 40 years, just ashes in the soil of the place he loved. But something remains, something more than the buildings and the tools and the museum exhibits, an idea, a possibility, a door that stays open for anyone who wants to walk through. You don't have to be Buckskin Bill. You couldn't be even if you tried, but you can be something, can build something, can create something that matters to you, even if no one else understands. That's the lesson. The only lesson that really matters. Find your canyon. Find your work. Find the thing that makes the struggle worthwhile. And then do it. Day after day. Year after year. Until you've built something that can't be taken away. It doesn't have to be grand. Doesn't have to be impressive to anyone but you. Maybe it's raising kids. Maybe it's making music. Maybe it's building a business or writing books or growing the best tomatoes on your block. The scale doesn't matter. What matters is the commitment, the showing up, the doing the work when you don't feel like it. Hart didn't become Buckskin Bill in a day. Took decades, took failures and setbacks and winters that almost killed him. But he kept going, kept building, kept adding one skill to another until he'd created something complete. That's the secret, maybe. Not being special, not being gifted, just being stubborn enough to keep going when most people would quit. He was stubborn, famously stubborn. The kind of stubborn that builds gun towers and stares down federal rangers, but also the kind of stubborn that bores rifle barrels by hand for months on end. That tends the same garden for 48 years. That wakes up every day and does the work because the work is the point. We could all use a little of that stubbornness, a little of that commitment, not to live in the wilderness, not to make our own guns, just to pick something and stick with it, to build instead of consume, to create instead of just watch. The river keeps flowing. It has for millions of years, will for millions more. The stars wheel overhead, same stars Hart watched, same stars humans have watched since we first looked up and wondered. And in a stone lodge on a sandbar called 5 Mile Bar, the ghost of a life well lived keeps vigil over the canyon. Not a real ghost, just a feeling, the sense that something important happened here, something worth remembering. The wind through the trees, the water over the rocks, the deep silence of a wild place. That's where he is now, part of all of it, forever. Your eyes are closing, your breathing slowing, your body heavy and warm. That's good. Let it happen. You've heard a story tonight, a true story, about a man who made choices most of us can't imagine making, who built a life most of us can't imagine living. Maybe you'll dream about it. Maybe you won't. Either way, something stays with you. A seed planted, an idea introduced. What would you do if you could do anything? What would you build if you had nothing but time and will? You don't have to answer tonight. Don't have to answer ever. Just let the question sit. Like a stone in your pocket. Something to turn over when you're bored or restless or wondering what life is for. Hart found his answer. Lived it every day for 48 years. You'll find yours, or you won't. Either way, you'll have lived. And honestly, that's enough. The canyon sleeps, the river dreams, the stars burn on, and somewhere, in that quiet place between waking and sleep, Buckskin Bill tips his ridiculous helmet and smiles. He made it, built the life he wanted, lived it fully, left something behind. Not bad for a Texas oil worker with $1 in his pocket and a head full of dreams. Not bad at all. The night is deep now, the darkness comfortable, the silence like a blanket pulled up around you. You're safe, you're warm, you're exactly where you need to be. And somewhere far away, in a canyon deeper than the Grand, a river keeps flowing past a stone lodge where a man once proved. Something worth proving. Sleep well, you've earned it.